Welcome, John, to your virtual award ceremony. We wanted to officially award you the Pennsylvania Humanities Council Heart and Soul Hero Award. This is your award, and we congratulate you on being recognized for the work that you've done during the coronavirus crisis in Meadville with the organization Not One More. And your nominators were Lee and Autumn, both from my Meadville, and as you know, around town. They are both very involved in community life, and we're going to hear from them in just a minute about why they nominated you, and and a little bit about your work. So John, congratulations. And can you introduce yourself, tell folks what is the work that you do, and if you have a response to winning the award. We'd love to hear some thoughts from you.
Yeah, well, I am John Hartnett. I reside in Meadville, Pennsylvania. My Meadville, as it was, is. And I am passionate about helping persons with substance use disorders and the community at large. Really passionate about trauma-informed community development. So those are my big interests, and I'm so grateful to be recognized.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about the organization, Not One More, that you're involved with?
Sure. I'm the president of Not One More. It is a chapter of a national organization. There's about 15, maybe 16 chapters across the nation. And our chapter was started by some mothers who were facing the opioid epidemic in their own lives, with their children or spouses or some combination. And they were really desirous of support. As substance use disorders are really stressful things to navigate. So I joined their organization shortly after they started it as a person in recovery. And since then, they put me in charge. Yeah, which has been such a blessing. And so pretty much what we do is we do substance use disorder advocacy. We distribute naloxone. We provide support groups for family members, and create awareness in our community to combat stigma and make treatment accessible to people.
Great, thanks, John, for that overview. And I have a few questions after we hear from Lee and Autumn about why they nominated you, regarding some of your work and the work in Meadville, particularly how you adapted to the COVID-19 crisis, or because of the COVID-19 crisis, and how you guys have adapted services. So Lee and Autumn, I don't know which one of you wants it. Both of you guys nominated John, by the way. We got 2 nominations for you, John. And I wanted to hear from you guys about why, when we read the nomination form, but I'd love to hear in your own words, what it is about John and his work and the organization and how they've responded to COVID-19 that really made you say, hey, these guys are, John's a heart and soul hero in Meadville.
Yeah, well, John is, before this crisis, is like the biggest advocate for support groups and for recovery, possibilities happening. And of course, the whole thing about support groups is they're about getting a bunch of people in a room together. And when that became not possible, I think, John, you were probably the first person in this area to transition a lot of support groups virtually and make sure that those were accessible to lots of different people and at lots of different times and for people who have a lot of different circumstances. So that to me was such a vital service. And I think we even probably saw an increase in participation through those virtual meetings, and people who maybe, can't make it to a regular support group, or maybe people who are dealing with additional stress because of the pandemic, who could maybe jump on just from their phone or from their car and just jump on whenever they could to get a little bit of serenity. So, yeah.
That's great, Lee. Thanks. And Autumn, what about you? You also nominated John, and I was wondering if you had any additional thoughts to what Lee said.
Yeah. I mean, I would echo everything that Lee said. John is kind of the biggest voice that we have in our community. Kind of a relentless advocate for folks with substance abuse disorders, folks trying to navigate the tricky waters of recovery, and really goes above and beyond, through Not One More, through his work at the Medical Center Foundation, Let's Talk campaign, and just like in his own life, it's like all blurred, but he's just doing so much, and kind of putting himself, behind the mission, right, of kind of helping people get through really tough times. That's always true. And that was a big part, I think, of our Heart and Soul initiative here. The opioid epidemic, people's struggles with addiction, with substance abuse disorders was at the forefront of people's minds. A lot of people were struggling with that. And, so one of our values is being a healthy community where people have access to healthcare and support services. And John was providing that already in spades, again, like doing that selflessly. And then, as Lee said, was so quick to transition to be able to offer that kind of support when people, in a time when people couldn't come together, and at a time that is really stressful. And so would add, this kind of additional layer of difficulty, right, in trying to kind of cope and manage, for folks who've already got, right, a lot to cope and manage. This community is a better place because John is in it. We're grateful for him.
Thank you guys for saying that. And John, how does that feel to hear all that? I mean, you may have already known it, but how does it feel?
Yeah, no, it's fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing, guys.
And I'd say too, like, John, there's probably so many millions of things that we don't even know about that you are doing, just because, like, you're so humble about it.
Well, yeah, I think humility is really important because none of these things would happen without support from people like Lee and, people being willing to get better.
Yeah.
And change their own lives, so.
Yeah, and what strikes me too about this, and Autumn mentioned this, and that's part of the reason why we created the award, is that how much this connects to, now you were doing this before, My Meadville started in the Heart and Soul process, or you were involved potentially in some of this stuff, but I think, how it lives out, how it shows the values that were created in Meadville through the My Meadville Heart and Soul process. I think it shows that, there were already assets in the community, right? And just lifting up those assets and celebrating them is really, really important. Doing so humbly, like you said, John, is important as well, because it's not like you're doing this alone. I mean, you have, clearly an organization and a community behind you. I'm curious, John, can you talk a little bit about how you adapted? So you mentioned you went to a virtual format. Can you talk about what that looked like? So was it like a Zoom thing? Like, what was the nature of how you guys adapted your services?
Well, I'm involved in many 12-step mutual help organizations, which I find is a modality that is really important for recovery because of availability and accessibility. But it just happened that I had started one at the beginning of the year called Anonymous, because I attend and try to support Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian 12-step modality, Overeaters Anonymous. It started right before COVID in our community. I regularly attend Al-Anon, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and at the end of the day, the 12 steps are just a great way to look at any problem you might encounter in life. And so that's kind of the premise of Anonymous Anonymous. The third tradition is the only requirement for membership is a desire to be your best self. And it's based on our common bond as a human. And so there's potentially 7-some billion members eligible. And, you know, the reality of substance use disorders are, a broad majority of them are informed by toxic stress and trauma, which is what we were seeing, you know, which is both a cause and effect of this COVID crisis. And, you know, just pretty immediately and slightly ahead of the curve, I just saw trauma reactions like happening with just everyday people, you know, which is natural. So we started doing Anonymous at 12:05 every day. And pretty much we're just engaging with spiritual principles that are really useful in these stressful times, such as acceptance, open-mindedness, willingness, patience, which just, you know, or just providing an outlet for people to share their discomfort, their vexation, their fears and anxieties in a place of non-judgment. And, you know, like, so I'm involved in those other organizations as well. And I'm blessed to have attended Zoom meetings before, and I was just like on one right before I like realized that like the proverbial stuff was about to hit the fan. And so I just kind of rallied to, you know, assist each of those fellowships adapt to this new format, you know, and I think it's really telling in that, you know, we created vibrant communities online, you know, and like connection is important, but it can happen in a variety of ways and a variety of formats. And like, you know, so pretty much we live in recovery every day at all times, and it's not about these meeting locations or the coffee in the basement of a church. Recovery is a daily effort, you know, so.
Yeah, and I'm struck by how, you know, I think a lot of time, well, at least during this time, there has been a lot of talk about how like it's almost been binary. It's like community means more, but community is really hard right now because everybody's separated. But I think, you know, what you're saying, John, and I don't know, Lee, what you and Autumn, what Lee and Autumn think about this as well, is community didn't go away, right? Just because, I mean, virtual spaces, of course, you know, are not accessible by everybody. You know, we will, you know, you can, you know, kind of see that there is a digital divide potentially. But what I like, John, about what you're saying is that, you know, the community was already there. And that it just, you know, you had to bring it to another format in order to make sure people felt supported during a time when trauma could really be re-triggered or reintroduced into someone's life. And I don't know if you guys have anything you want to say about the idea of community, particularly during COVID-19, and if what you've seen in Meadville and how the response has been to the idea of how, you know, if community, you know, community being important and staying connected.
Well, you know, I'd say it's tough, right?
Yeah.
This is like uncomfortable. And the whole situation was uncomfortable, right? So I'd say that people in recovery really engaged in this virtual space, and some people that were between a rope and a bottle, like availed themselves of this digital opportunity. There's a lot of fear and ego and misapprehension, like going into this space and like online and being vulnerable.
Yeah.
You know, so I'd say that engagement wasn't as deep and wide as I think it could have been, but I think that's natural when you're dealing with all these other fear and uncertainty of the unknown, you know?
Yeah, I would say too, like, I was going to start off by saying it's tough, but I'll start instead by saying, I think a friend of ours, Taylor, said the other day that this is going to be hard and we have to just all know that. And I don't know, it's been like, so I've been participating in some of these meetings with John, and I've met at least 3 people that I would call friends now. And they were people I didn't know before who lived around me and have lived here forever. And I just didn't meet them before. And then, but we all have this like very acutely shared experience right now that like, even though I'm not communicating with people as regularly or seeing them as regularly, it's like when I do see them, it feels very much like almost this like disembodied feeling, like we're just like together, like doing this thing together and just like trying to do things to make sure that we all are okay and all stay healthy. So it almost feels like even though we're so isolated right now, like it's more collective now than it has ever been.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that. It's the shared experience that's happening, right? That I think you're pointing to, Lee. And John, you mentioned this too, that folks engaged in the online community who hadn't normally potentially engaged before. And it sounds like Lee's saying, that this also afforded an opportunity for people to connect with others that they would not, normally maybe, haven't been introduced to before. And so there's an element of continually building community with this, despite the fact that you said there are some limitations. Some folks just won't connect. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, worry and anxiety out there, right? That people are dealing with. But it does sound like this is one of those things where, the new platform has actually, there's been some really great outcomes, despite the fact that things have been challenging. So yeah, I don't know. Just, I just wanted to say, congratulations on, moving into this space. And I know it's not easy. We could have a whole discussion on how communities will have to grieve and recover some of what, has been like lost. And I'm wondering, John, too, so this brings up another question. I don't know if you've been able to hear from anybody who's been involved in Anonymous online, and how, being able to respond quickly the way you have during this crisis and understand that people still need to be connected in some way and just trying something, right? How that's been, any feedback on how that's impacted individuals that have participated in this format?
Well, I've had some pretty good outcomes, even for myself, say, I have never engaged in the online recovery community a day in my life. But I think, we have to recognize that in our society, there are so many structural inequities, and like people with varying abilities and commitments. So like, for me, I've grown incredibly through this process, which is part and parcel of the 12-step modality. Once, by helping other people, I'm helping myself, right? And even with me, the commitment for an hour meeting via Zoom is an hour. Whereas, an IRL meeting, you have to account for getting there on time, You have to account for driving there, maybe picking someone else up, maybe giving them a ride home, sticking around and chatting. You have to prepare coffee, perhaps, if you're hosting the meeting. So I just think it's created an incredible opportunity to really dig into literature. And, you know, I've probably been following about 7 people that have engaged with recovery for the first time in the midst of this COVID epidemic. And obviously recovery is a really tenuous thing, and this is an incredibly tenuous time for everyone, period. The outcomes are that they're not dead, you know, but they're growing and they're, you know, making steps at improving their lives. And some of the growth has been incredible in the midst of this crisis, you know, and I don't know if that would have been my experience, you know. This is a really tough time to engage with recovery, and I'm really excited to have brought some new people into the fold.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important what you said, that this, you know, being able to adapt, it sounds like there was an online community probably before this, but for you guys to be able to adapt this, right? And in this time could have saved lives, right? I mean, this is really, people feel even more isolated. I was just listening to a podcast on the difference between feeling lonely versus isolated. And I think both of those things are happening right now for various people, you know, but particularly the recovery community, you know, that isolation can be really detrimental, right? And so to be able to at least have an opportunity, like you said, that's maybe a little easier in some ways to just engage for the hour, right? And just say, I'm going to click right on, and then I have people there that I could talk to or listen to, you know, if I don't want to talk, I think is really important during this time, because you're right, there is a lot of recovery that's happening just generally, but this is a special, you know, this is an audience that really deserves a space to be able to work through that in the way that they need to. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm wondering, you guys, if, you know, if you have any last words about, you know, this, because we could talk about this for hours. I'm so fascinated by the work that you do, John, in terms of, you know, really being able to, you know, selflessly kind of say, hey, we need to do this. We need to be able to connect the people who feel isolated even more so now. But my main question for you guys is, you know, what have you discovered about Meadville during this process? Anything, you know, that, you know, has been a new discovery, or any, you know, thing that you already knew about the community, but has just been really enhanced by, you know, the strange pandemic world we're living in?
I'd have to say our relative resilience.
Yeah.
You know, I think overdoses are not going well at this time, but I'm really surprised that our entire nation hasn't fallen into total disarray. That people have managed to keep their cool in the face of these intense economic circumstances that were present before this, that have just been exacerbated by loss of employment and healthcare. I think if I would have faced unemployment, I would have lost it. But, you know, in this work, I was blessed to have a purpose. And yeah, so.
Lee, Autumn, anything you guys are discovering or, you know, reconnecting with in terms of Meadville during this time?
Yeah, I think I'll just say, you know, I mean, I'm not living in another place right now, so I don't know what it's like in other communities, but you know, it's been 2 months of people really just totally changing their lifestyles, and just the way that they move through the world. And I think for the most part, I've been really like just impressed and proud of like my neighbors who, you know, are just willing to just like, it just kind of seems like everyone was willing to make these changes to make sure that people were safe and okay, and you know, do what they needed to do. I think people are getting a little restless now, right, as things start to reopen, and but even in that too, we're seeing that people are you know, willing to do to kind of go to great lengths to kind of keep their neighbors safe and healthy, and yeah, and I think that yeah, it feels true here, it feels special here, but I'm sure that's the case other places, and it's nice to see.
Lee, any thoughts on that? Or on the question?
Yeah, I don't know why this is the first thing that came to my mind, but I think this has reinforced kind of like how small we are, this community. And with that, I think the goods and the bads for sure have been demonstrated. Kind of all the goods that John and Autumn have expressed, and the goods too of just like seeing people that like live literally 3 houses down from me just like stepping up in ways that I didn't know that they could, or that they maybe had the will to do, and they were just like doing cool things, and then also just like in the small ways, again, how I've mentioned, just like seeing how power is distributed, even just in such a small community like this, and how it's in some ways unequally distributed, but then in other ways how it's you know, it's manifesting in different ways, and people, like I said, down the road, just like seizing on the opportunity to help people out when they can. So yeah, it's been weird.
Yeah.
For all of us.
Yeah. 100%. And that power thing and the equity piece that you guys have like hinted at, I think is something, I mean, we're seeing it across the country, but particularly in Pennsylvania, you know, in different communities, how that's showing up. And I'm sure I hope that'll be a conversation so that we can start to change some of that, right, for real, in the next, you know, in the recovery process from all of this. John, one last question for you. Since, you know, you have dedicated, you know, kind of your work and your life, because it's very personal to you, to the idea of helping folks that have substance use, you know, challenges and are trying to recover. What would you want the public to know about how they can help individuals, you know, within their own community that are, you know, challenged by substance use issues?
Just to recognize that people do recover, treatment is available, and recovery is possible, and just to recognize that these are people that are dealing with illness that affects them physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, relationally, in incredibly profound ways, and these aren't people that we need to ostracize. These are people we need to reach out there and help, because it can be your kid or someone you love. It can happen to anyone, regardless of ethnicity, education, social class, economic circumstances.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So thank you guys for being a part of today's award ceremony. I know it's a little strange to do this virtually. We had hoped that, you know, we came up with this during the virtual time, but, you know, ideally we would be able to do this in person and celebrate, you know, the work of John and, you know, my Meadville and all that good stuff. But thank you guys for being a part of this. And John, I know you're incredibly busy as well, so I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And congratulations again. PHC, you know, like I mentioned, this is really an extension of the work we've done with Heart and Soul, and I think also speaks to, you know, we're a humanities council, and it, you know, the humanities are about how people live their lives, you know, histories, how they learn from experience, and honoring different stories. And I think you said it absolutely perfectly, John. The folks that are, struggling with substance use challenges are people. They have experiences, they have feelings, they have lives, and they deserve to be seen and, included in community life. So I appreciate you guys, Lee and Autumn, recognizing that and for nominating John.